Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 300 library systems across the United States, Canada, and New Zealand with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the wonderful, best-selling, and highly acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, we are happy to welcome New York Times best-selling author Jeffrey Selingo to talk to us about his best-selling book, Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions. Hi, Jeff. How are you?
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Good. Thank you for being here. Before we get started, I do want to kind of hit all that housekeeping information that lets everything run a little more smoothly, tells people how to ask questions, so on and so forth. We have compiled some viewer questions, of course, with pre-submission. But we will also be taking your additional questions throughout this conversation. So when you do have a direct question for Jeff, you can click that questions button that's just below the live stream. There are 3 tabs there. One says questions, and you can submit your question at any time. Keep in mind, there are quite a few of you tuning in today, so we'll get to as many questions as we can. If you are unable to attend the full talk for any reason, you will receive a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours, and in that email, you can find a link to the recording. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today. Jeff Selingo has written about higher education for more than 2 decades and is a New York Times bestselling author of 3 books. His latest book and the book of note for today, Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions, was published in September 2020 and was named among the 100 notable books of the year by the New York Times. A regular contributor to The Atlantic, Jeff is a special advisor for innovation and professor of practice at Arizona State University. He also co-hosts the podcast Future You. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his family. Again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's great to be here. I'm a little under the weather, but really excited to talk with this audience.
Well, we're doubly appreciative that you're here. Can understand that there's a lot going around right now, so we hope that we won't hurt your throat too much. Well, I guess let's just start then with kind of setting up the book, the context for the book. Can you go ahead and set that up for us? Why did you write it, and how did you go about reporting it?
So the context for the book was that if you talk to many parents and students, or many parents who are going through the college admissions process with their kids these days, if they went to college, they probably went to college in the 1980s, early 1990s. And many of them talk to me about how difficult it is to get into college today compared to when they went, that they would never get into the college that they went to. There was just this narrative out there that getting into college was impossible. And after covering higher education as a journalist for more than 25 years, I actually knew that wasn't correct. In fact, the average acceptance rate at American college or university is 65%. So most colleges accept most students. What most of these parents were talking about were actually what we refer to as selective colleges. So there are about 200 colleges in the US that accept fewer than 50% of students who apply. So that means some of them could still be in the 40%. And of course, then there's these ultra selective institutions, the Ivy Leagues and places like Stanford and so forth that are under 5%. And so I wanted to get inside that process to show people that it is not necessarily a meritocracy, that there are a lot of competing demands in play, and give them a little bit of the history of the college admissions process. Largely, the whole goal of the book was if they saw that process, then maybe they would enlarge their view of colleges and apply to more than just those same 10, 20, 30, 40 schools that everybody applies to, and certainly go beyond the 200 that are selective. And so, the year before COVID, I approached somebody. Always asks, like, well, how did you get inside how did you pick the 3 schools where I was embedded in the admissions process? And in some ways it worked like admissions. I approached 24 schools, so 24 in total, and asked them if I could sit in their admissions office for an entire cycle. So essentially from November through May or April. Okay. And all but 3 said no. So it is a little bit like applying to 24 schools and getting rejected by all but 3. And so I got accepted by these 3 that said I could sit in their in their process. And so that included Emory University, so a big private in Atlanta, Davidson College, a small liberal arts college in North Carolina, and the University of Washington, a big public in Seattle. And so even if you're not applying to one of those schools, the thing I liked about these three institutions is they kind of stand in for the different types of institutions that are out there. Big public flagship, small liberal arts college, big private or private institution, right? So we kind of hit all three of the types of institutions that people might be applying to. And so for an entire year, I sat in their offices. I read applications with them. There were only two limitations on what I could do. One was I'm one person and I couldn't be in three places at once. Mm-hmm. So I would go to some of these offices for a couple of days at a time and then come back a couple of weeks later, a couple of days at a time. And then the second limitation was, while everything in the book could be factually correct about the students I was reading their applications, I couldn't personally identify them in any way. And so that's what I did for the course of a year. And then I roll into the book also following a group of seniors who were applying everywhere that year. And I end up profiling three of them in the book. And then also look at what I call the admissions kind of ecosystem, the marketing, the testing, the rankings, all the stuff that goes around. And so all three of these buckets of characters, the institutions, these students, and these kind of players in the admission system make up the narrative of the book.
Okay. You mentioned parents who had approached you saying that it's much harder to get into schools now than it was when they applied. And basically I've heard people say that they couldn't get in to their alma mater now if they tried. So what do you think then are kind of those most significant changes that occurred in the last 15 to 20 years or so?
So it's a fascinating question. And there are three big trends that happened in admissions since essentially today's Gen Xers went to college themselves. The first trend is that our definition of distance has changed dramatically, right? My sister, who's 8 years older than I am, went to college away from home, and she would call on a payphone in the dorm room, in the dorm hallway, after 10 o'clock at night to call home, because that's when long distance rates were lower. And now we have these things like in our pocket where you could talk to your kid constantly on FaceTime, right? So this idea of, even as late as the 80s and early 90s, the idea that you would kind of pick up and move from New York to go to California to go to college was, still kind of unusual. And so that concept of distance changing now meant that colleges and students weren't operating in these local or regional pools anymore. They were now applying everywhere. And the best students now, and Miami and Boston and Florida or wherever, we're now applying to the same set of schools, and international students as well. So that's the first trend, this concept of distance. The second thing was the Common App. So the Common App has existed since the 1970s. It used to be a paper application. But I graduated high school in 1991. I actually still had to type out my college applications. And then the internet came along a couple of years later. And that, combined with the Common App, meant essentially with the press of a button, you could apply to multiple schools at the same time. And so, when I was applying to college, students applied to maybe 5 or 6 schools. Today, their average is 8, 9, and more usual in many schools or many high schools, it's maybe 12 or 13 or 14 applications. And so you had this huge application inflation at the same time that some schools were not increasing the size of their freshman class. So you have number of applications going up, number of acceptances essentially staying the same. That means they become more selective. So that's the second big trend. And then the third big trend is something that I think is happening economically across the world, is that we have a sense that opportunity is scarce. And I think this is very different than my generation, where, we knew there were a lot of jobs out there. There were a lot of careers. A lot of that has changed. Just take my own career of journalism. I wanted to be a newspaper reporter. I was a newspaper reporter for quite some time. Those careers have disappeared for the most part, right? And so I think that when we sense that opportunity is scarce, we tend to kind of grab anything that we can that helps us get the opportunities that are left. And there's this belief, I think it's false, but there's this belief that if you go to, quote unquote, the most selective colleges, that you're going to be able to grab those opportunities, and only those opportunities are available to people who go to selective colleges. Again, I don't think that's a true narrative, but I think there was this belief out there. So everybody started to rush to the most selective colleges.
Mhm. Do you think that ties into a hike in tuition prices? More people applying, therefore it looks like there's more of a demand, and so then the universities keep hiking tuition prices.
Yeah, I think this was happening at two different levels. So, for example, the wealthy institutions, essentially, where there was a huge demand for their product, quote unquote, they could raise tuition as much as they want. People say Harvard could charge $1 million and still get people to pay. And then what happened at the less selective schools, they had to kind of keep up, right? They had to, the Wall Street Journal had a great piece on this about 2 weeks ago about public universities. They had to spend money to build new academic programs, to build new dorms, to build new academic buildings, to put money into professorships and libraries and things like that. And all that costs more money. And they didn't have the wealth of these more selective colleges. So they had to borrow money, and they had to go to their state legislature. And most important, they had to ask students for more tuition dollars.
Okay. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. So after covering higher education then for more than 2 decades, what have you learned that will help parents and students through this kind of daunting admissions process?
I guess the best thing to realize is that this is a consumer product that you're buying like anything else. It's like buying a house. It's like buying a car. And one thing that I see is that emotion tends to take over this process. If you went to college, you may or may not, I don't assume, but you may or may not have, love for your alma mater, right? And you may think it was the most special time of your life. It was incredibly influential in your life. You may have met your best friends, your life partner, whoever, right? At college. And thus I think emotion tends to take over. And when our kids start applying, we tend to have that same emotion take over. And we also see it as a capstone to their childhood, right? And that we see so much of what they're doing in our own life and say, oh, well, if they go to a great school, that means I was a great parent. And so all this emotion plays into what, at the end of the day, is a consumer decision, particularly by these colleges, which at the end of the day are largely businesses that have seats to fill. And they have to fill these seats by a combination of, charging full tuition to some, discounting others, and things like that. And so I think going into this with this consumer mentality that we're going to look for the best fit, both financially, socially, and academically on all three fronts. And that at the end of the day is what we're buying. That we're buying a good fit academically, we're buying a good fit socially. And most important, the piece that I think, again, emotion takes over for is that financial fit, that we're not going to go deep into debt as a family or as a student to reach for a school that, I don't know, maybe a little bit better, but maybe not that much better than the other school that is just a better deal financially.
Yeah. While we're still kind of on that thread of financially, a question from the book that we have is, so college pricing, I guess, seems to be more akin to kind of airline fares and merit aid, more like a Macy's coupon or a coupon in general, right? So could you briefly explain terms that you map out in the book, like published price, net price, merit aid, need-based aid, et cetera? So if you're new to the system, how does it work, and how might it be different from when today's parents who are helping their kids get ready now went to college?
So you may see something called a published price or a sticker price. And that's the price that you often hear, oh, college is, at a private is 70,000, 60,000 all in, room, board, tuition, or at a public college, it's 40,000 or 30,000 all in. At many places, a lot of people don't pay that. Like the number of full payers at a lot of these places is pretty small. And in some cases, almost zero pay the full published price. When I was in school, but really starting in the 80s, up until then, most financial aid was based on need. You would fill out forms, and if your family had need, you would get scholarships, you would get financial aid, you would take out loans. If you didn't have financial need, you still could get loans, but for the most part, you didn't get much aid. And that started to really change in the 80s, where colleges started to use something they called merit aid, which is not based on need. Now, you might hear the term merit and you think, oh, well, they're just giving it to the, the most qualified academic students. But it really wasn't that. It really was literally a discount. And they had these over time developed these very sophisticated models where they were able to say, okay, if we offer Jeff a $10,000 merit scholarship, and we call it that, but really all it is a $10,000 discount. He will come into our store. This is very much a retail way of thinking about it. He will come to our store and he's going to bring all this other money with him, whether that's from family savings or other outside scholarships or loans. And he will come to our school and he will cost us $10,000 or $10,000 in foregone revenue, essentially. But he's going to bring $40,000 of revenue to us. And now today, the average discount of an American college or university for first-year students is 50%. So if you see those published rates, again, most people don't pay them, $80,000. The average discount is essentially $40,000. And so that's the net tuition. The net tuition is what you're actually paying. This is a number that you could find on the Department of Education website for every college that exists out there. You could see it by income level. So, between $40,000 and $50,000 of income, family income, this is the average net price that families are paying. And that's what you're going to see. And that's really what you're thinking about is like, at the end of the day, it's not the sticker price that matters. It's what you're actually going to pay for college.
Okay. All right. There's a lot to unpack there. Okay.
It's confusing. And I, again, this is why I think being a smart consumer is important, because you wouldn't go buy a car or a house and not really kind of literally kick the tires, right? You wouldn't, I guess some people do buy a house online, right, without ever seeing it. But I think there needs to be this mentality that this is a consumer good we're buying. We need to get smart about it. We need to really approach it in a much more deliberate way.
Well, with that in mind, let's back up for a moment then and kind of talk about the different kinds of admission processes that schools use. I know you mentioned earlier, the selective, like kind of 200, but then there's, everyone else. So what are the differences in their admissions processes? Other than
at the vast majority of colleges and universities that accept the majority of students who apply, they have a rubric that when they get an application, they'll look at it and they'll say, can the student succeed here? It's a pretty cursory process of admissions. It might be done by a small group of people. And there are some institutions that are really referred to as open admissions, which basically means everybody who applies gets in, right? So that's on one end of the spectrum. And then as you get a little bit more selective, there is some process where they do accept and reject others. And then at these more highly selective or selected places, there are much larger admissions offices where they would have readers of applications, either full-time readers, or in the case of the University of Washington and a lot of these big public universities that might get 100,000+ applications, they have a small admission staff, and then they bring in part-time readers who could be, graduate students. They could be retired people who read these applications over the course of a couple of months. And literally that's what they're doing. They get an application. It's usually electronic. It's all electronic now. They maybe spend 8 to 10 minutes with it. Some of these places have multiple readers, so they may have a first read. They send it on to somebody else, a second read, and then that decision is made. It's either an acceptance, a rejection, a wait list, or they send it on to what they call committee. So if the readers maybe differ on what they think of this applicant, or it's kind of an edge case and they don't know what to do with it, they will then, especially at these larger places, smaller places might review everybody in committee. They'll send it on to what they call an admissions committee, and that will be a larger group of people who will look again at this application. And the reader who read it originally will present it and say, what do we think? And then again, it will be an up, a down, or they'll say, let's put the person on the wait list.
Okay. So what does that then do for what we call early decision now? Michael is saying, can you please address early decision and how that plays out in the admissions office?
So another big change in admissions over the years is that when many of us applied to college, is that there was a deadline, right? Usually January 1st, you had to get your application in. You'd find out, sometimes weeks later if they were on something called rolling admissions, or they would tell you in March, you would have all of April to decide, and May 1st, you sent in your deposit. That's kind of the calendar that higher ed used for a long time. Early decision's been around for a while, but it really took off over the last 10, 12 years. And that means that there's something called early decision and early action. So I want to kind of define them separately.
Okay.
In both cases, you submit an application, quote unquote, early, which means usually around November 1st of your senior year, you will have had to apply to college. And early action, you could apply usually multiple places, early action. And what that means is that your application is going to be looked at first, and you will get an answer usually in January or February, usually in January, sometimes February, sometimes December, and you have until May 1st to make a decision. Early decision slightly different in that you usually only could apply really one place. You can't apply multiple places early decision. And you make that bet somewhere that you're going to get in. The reason why it's one place is because if you get in, it's a binding decision. Meaning if you get accepted, you're going there, you're supposed to withdraw all your other applications that you have out there, whether those are early action or regular decision applications, and that's it. You're fully committed to that place. And so that's the difference between early decisions binding, early action is not binding. Both, though, get the process done early. And what we've seen is a huge increase in the number of students applying early because they want an answer early. And that's largely why they've been doing it. And colleges like it because they get a sense of their class, right? They get a sense of, in early decision, they get all these commitments. So they get to fill their class early. And in early action, they get a sense of who's really interested in them. Because if you're applying early, you're probably really interested in that school.
Yeah. But you're not going to, is there a certain percentage of early decision that's accepted? Like, do they cut it off at like, the class is now 25% full, we're going to save it for the
Well, that used to be the case, right? They used to say, we're only going to take 25% of our kids early, and then we're going to take 75% in regular decision. And the big change in early over the last 15, 20 years is that number has increased dramatically. So at some colleges and universities, and this is something you could find out from them, they might take half their class in early decision. In some cases, they might take 60% of their class in early decision. I think the year I was at Davidson, they might have taken 55, 60% of their class early. Now you might say, well, that leaves 40, 45, 50% of seats left. But remember, the vast majority of students apply in regular decision. So you have a small group applying early, and then you have this huge group applying for the remaining seats in regular. So it is slightly easier. There's a lot of caveats, but there's slightly easier to get in early decision. Not as easy as it used to be, but because there are fewer students applying in early decision. That's key because early decision again is binding.
Well, as we've been talking about the admissions process, maybe we should talk about kind of what gives candidates an edge. So, the weight of the application, the weight of the essay, student activities, teacher recommendations. Deepa is asking, should AP classes I take be related to the major that I aspire to do in college? Like, what is the weight of this relative package?
So what's key here is that the most important part of a college application is the high school record. And that is the high school transcript, which includes the classes that they have taken and the grades that they've gotten in those classes. And the reason why that's important is because a lot of research has shown that a student's performance over 4 years of high school really matters to how they perform in college. And so colleges, especially again, these more selective colleges, really lean into that transcript. Did the student take advantage of the most difficult classes they could at their high school? Now, every high school is different, right? We have 25,000+ high schools in the United States alone. Not everybody has the same curriculum. In fact, no two schools really have the same curriculum. So what's available to them? And colleges know that because they get what's called a school profile along with the application. So they know what the student had available to them. They know what the student took, and then they know how the student did in those classes. That by far is, at some schools, that might get you 60 to 65% all the way to the finish line in terms of getting accepted, just the transcript alone.
Okay.
Then they will look at other things. They will look at test scores if they have them, and they'll see how do they fit with the grades. Most of the time they're going to be a similar story, right? High grades, high test scores. Then they're going to look at, activities. Is this a well-rounded student? What do the teacher recommendations or things like that say? So they're going to be looking at a variety of factors, but for the most part, the heaviest weight is going to be given to that high school record.
Okay. We had quite a few people ask about admissions consultants, especially as it pertained to personal statements and writing that essay to get in. Abigail is saying, how do colleges look at personal statements, and are admissions consultants beneficial?
So personal statements and admissions consultants. So let me start with admissions consultants. I have a lot of friends who are admissions consultants, or maybe some on the call today. And I think, if admissions consultants are like a lot of they're like a trainer at the gym. They're like somebody who's going to do your house cleaning. They're like somebody who's going to do your yard. They help you with a process that is, in this case, complicated and time consuming. And so if you don't have the time and you don't have support from a school counselor, and in some cases you may not because they're overwhelmed. School counselors are great, but they have huge workloads. That you may want to hire an independent counselor for that reason. The other reason is you might disagree, and I see this happen sometimes, with the parent and the student might disagree, right? And so the parent might want the student to go in one direction, the student might want to go in a different direction. And it's always nice to have an outside perspective on that. And that is, again, something that the independent consultant can do. It's not 100% necessary to have one. It's not going to necessarily help you in fact, it's not going to help you get into a school that you can't get into otherwise. They might open your eyes to schools that are not out there otherwise. So they're going to provide you information that you could easily get on your own, or I should say you could get on your own, but this is an easier route to get on your own. And they have experience, right, in working with clients over the years. So that's that. In terms of personal statements, there's a lot of help you can get with personal statements now. You could hire consultants just to work on your personal statement. A lot of teachers will do that in school. There's a lot of help online now. It is in some ways why the personal statement is not given. It's given weight, but it's not given so much weight that it's something that gets people in or not.
Okay. But it might be that if you are up against, 75 other straight A candidates who have similar transcripts as you, it might be the thing that kind of is a tipping point, perhaps.
It could definitely help you. It could also hurt you a little bit. But again, it's one of many factors beyond, once they get, it's not going to make up, for example, for a bad high school record, right? If you have a bunch of bad grades or you didn't take a hard number of courses, a great personal statement is not going to make up for that.
Okay. And you also mentioned test scores, if that's something that's required. We had a lot of people ask about kind of these test optional nowadays. I think maybe that started over COVID, where schools started getting rid of the SAT and the ACT, or making it optional in the admissions process. Do you think that's here to stay?
So test optional was around actually before COVID. About 1,000 schools were test optional before COVID, but the most selective schools that were test optional were like the University of Chicago and Wake Forest. Most selective schools, meaning those in the top 30, 50 of U.S. News and World Reports, require test scores. And then in the spring of 2020, because it was so difficult to get a test score, or to get a test, I should say, and you couldn't get a score as a result, all these schools went test optional. I really thought that schools would go back to requiring testing within a couple of years, but we've seen most schools haven't. And so now you are in a period where you have some schools still require tests. Many schools are test optional. Some schools are even test blind, like the University of California. They won't even look at it. Test optional, though, is the biggest bucket of schools, and it is what it says, right? It means that you have the option of submitting a score. And I will tell you that it is, it's not very clear what that really means, right? Because most of these schools will not be very transparent about how many students submitted scores that were that applied, or they won't tell you how many students submitted scores who were accepted. So you have really no idea. Does optional really mean optional?
Yeah.
And so the rule of thumb is, take a test, see how you do. And then if you feel like the test is going to tell a good story about you, the advice I always give to students is, you are presenting a case to the admissions officer on the other side of the desk. You want to tell that person all the good stuff you can. And if the test score is a good thing, send it. Now, the question I get is, how do we know if the test score is a good thing, right? Because a 1,300 or 1,200 on the SAT is different depending on where you're applying. And the rule of thumb is that you want to look at schools advertise what their top 25% of applicants, or in some cases accepted students, scored, what the middle 50% scored, and what the bottom 25% scored. Now, the problem is those are only the people now who have submitted scores, and most of the people submitting scores have good scores, right? So there's been a little inflation on those numbers. And so this is where it gets very difficult, because you're trying to decide, should I submit this score or not? And if you have 10 schools on your list, you might submit them to 3 and not submit them to 7, right? You're constantly making these decisions. I guess the piece of advice I will tell you is, talk to your admissions, talk to your college counselor at school, talk to your independent counselor if you have it. Try to make a decision, but don't tear your hair out over it. If you get in, it's not because of that score. And if you don't get in, it's not because of that score. You didn't submit it, right? It's not going to be the thing that keeps you in or out. It is important, but it's not. I see a lot of parents worrying over whether to submit or not. And I think it's a decision. It's a strategy you should think about, but I don't think it's something that you should lose sleep over or think about for weeks on end. Because it's, at the end of the day, it's either going to work or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. So you spend a couple of chapters discussing kind of direct marketing and rankings. And Vic wants to know, there are so many colleges that we don't know about. So what is the strategy for exploring these colleges that are not on our radar, but might be hidden gems and are a good fit? And I think that maybe your 2 chapters kind of get to that why.
Yeah. So I think you're really looking for schools that, first of all, they have to be the right size and the right distance from home and have the right social scene and be a good fit financially, right? Like if it doesn't even get over that hurdle, there's no use looking at them. But really what you're looking for schools, and this is a question I get all the time, like, okay, well, if we're going to look beyond the top 20 or top 30 or top 50 or whatever schools, like what are we looking for? And there's a couple of things. One of the things you're looking for is retention, right? Is this a school that for the vast majority of students, they return? The retention rate shows that they return their sophomore, junior, and senior year. Schools are always going to lose students, right? Even Harvard doesn't have 100% retention rate. But if, say 50 or 60% of the students return for their sophomore year and 40% don't, or 50% don't, that's a little worrisome, right? So that's a number you want to look at. You want to look at the 4 and 6 year graduation rate. Like, how long does it take to graduate? Now, the vast majority of students, believe it or not, about half of students don't graduate in 4 years, believe it or not, in American colleges and universities on average. At some schools, it's, 90+% graduate in 4 years. And so that's what you want to look for. Like, what are my chances of actually getting in, staying in, and getting out of here in 4 years? So that's like one hurdle that you want to get over. You want to go to a place where you are going to succeed. Then you're going to look for what I call these other X factors. How good are they at helping you find mentors? How accessible are the faculty? Do the faculty actually teach first year students? How good are the internships for students? How good is the job placement for students? So look at the career center. That's where you have to get a feel for the current student body, and you do that by talking to current faculty members. How welcoming are they to you as a prospective student? Talking to current students, how welcoming are they? What do they like? What do they dislike? spending time on campus, eating in the dining halls, getting a vibe for the place. Really looking at, okay, in this academic program, what are the internships? What are their job placement rates? Where are they working after graduation? Those are the types of things that you're looking for. And at the most part, we're mostly talking about undergraduate students here, right? Students who are going for their baccalaureate, their bachelor's degree. There's a lot of institutions that are big universities, right, that have a lot of graduate students. And sometimes the faculty care a lot more about the graduate students than they care about the undergraduate students. So while this mythical place might have a great reputation as a great university, the question is, you're not going there as a graduate student. You're going there first as an undergraduate student. And are you going to get the care and the feeding from faculty members and from your peers that you would normally get? And I think this is something that people don't think enough about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people are also the finance kind of discussion. That's at top of mind. So how do families' finances enter into this college admissions process? Do admissions officers know how much a family makes, and how does that play into the admissions process? I know that there are plenty of people who say that they're above the poverty line, and their children wouldn't qualify for financial aid, but they still couldn't afford it. So how does that play in?
So just like early decision and early action, a very complicated process. So there are what are called need blind institutions. There's only there's a lot of these institutions that are need blind, and that means they don't take a family's income into consideration in the admissions process. Now, that sounds great, right? But most of them cannot meet full demonstrated need. Full demonstrated need basically means, by this formula set up by the government, this is how much money you really need to afford this place. And most colleges that are need blind will accept you, but then they'll send you a financial aid package that for most families is just not workable. There are a group of colleges that are need blind and meet full demonstrated need. There are only about 50 of those colleges in the United States, and they're incredible. They're the ones you probably would know about. They're incredibly wealthy, incredibly hard to get into, but they meet full demonstrated need. So they don't take your finances into consideration, and they say, if this is the amount of money you need to go here, we will give it to you. Then there are need aware schools. So this is something where these schools take your financial background into consideration when accepting you. And in some cases, they'll say, you know what, we love this student. We love Jeff. We cannot afford to give him the financial aid he needs. So instead, we are going to deny him, because it's not fair for us to accept him and then be like those other schools that give him a financial aid package that he cannot afford. So they are need aware. And again, these schools will tell you this in the process. So need blind, but then broken into two groups: meet full need, don't meet full need, and then need aware, where they look at your financial background. Because what they will say is, if they accept you, they will try really hard to meet your full demonstrated need.
And if they deny you based on the fact that they don't think it would be fair to accept you and you not be able to afford it, will they say that you're denied based on financial?
No, they don't tell you that.
Kind of crushes.
That's sometimes the reason they are denying you.
Okay.
And there's a big debate around the ethics of this in admissions, because there's a belief that, it's more ethical to deny somebody who cannot afford it and you cannot give them the money. And then others who say, well, that's unfair. Why should you deny them just because they can't afford it? Maybe they'll figure out a way to afford it, right? So there's a big debate about this in higher education, and it's not an easy one to solve, because I have seen parents stretch financially to afford, quote unquote, the dream college of their school kid, and it doesn't always work out.
Mm-hmm. That goes to the heart of a question that we've got a few times: is can you only get scholarships after being admitted somewhere? Because there are plenty of websites where you can apply for scholarships online. Can you do that before being admitted, so that you can kind of bring that up as some of your financial need being covered?
Yeah. So For an institutional scholarship, you do have to be accepted first. So if the institution is giving you the scholarship, you have to be accepted first. For outside scholarships, meaning organizations or states or other things, you could apply for those separately without getting accepted. The important thing for private scholarships that are given out by organizations, you'll have to report those to the school, and many schools will reduce their aid by the amount of aid that you're getting from outside. So sometimes it's not a huge advantage to be getting that aid.
Okay. And if you do get accepted without any sort of financial package, then or institutional scholarships, what are some places that you can go to try to find organization scholarships, private scholarships?
I mean, there's a lot you could ask the school. They usually keep lists of very reputable places where you can find scholarships. They will also point you to loans, of course, that you could take out. You could look in your community, ask your school counselor for that. There is a lot of private scholarships available. But again, it is a complicated process. It usually has early deadlines. You're so focused on applying for college that you sometimes forget, oh, I also have to apply for these scholarships. And sometimes it's too late by the time spring rolls around.
Mhm. All right. So you write that the anxiety about getting into a brand name school starts with the single fundamental principle believed by students and parents in top high schools. It matters where you go to college. Can you please reflect on your belief that it's actually what one does at college that is more important than where one goes to college?
So, you could go to the greatest college on the face of the earth, show up, try, muddle your way through courses, get a decent grade, get a piece of paper at the end. And yeah, could you get a job? Sure. But you're then going to be competing with people who maybe went to quote unquote less selective colleges. And, but they're going to have internship opportunities, right? They're going to have done internships. They're going to have worked, be presidents of clubs. They will have done undergraduate research with one of their professors, right? They have it's what you do that helps you gain the skills, the mindset, the knowledge that you're going to use in the workforce afterwards. And that is incredibly powerful. It can help make up for going to a quote unquote less selective college because you have a resume that, yes, may not have that name brand on it, but it has all of this experience that when I talk to people who hire, value a lot more sometimes than the name on that degree.
Mhm. Yeah, it's good to know. Definitely good to know. So we have a few questions about kind of diversity, and I know in your book you say a complex that college admissions is a complex process through which competing institutional and political interests influence whom admissions officers choose as they build a diverse class. So from your experience, do you think this definition is accurate? And Lee is asking, could you talk about the geographic diversity that colleges are looking for?
Right. So colleges are looking for all kinds of diversity, right? They're looking for racial and ethnic diversity. They're looking for gender diversity, right? So 60% of college students now are women, 40% are men. They like to keep those ratios closer to 50-50. There's a lot more women applying to college. So that's one piece that they look at, right? They are looking for geographic diversity. If they're in the Southeast, they want a decent amount of people from the Northwest, for example, and they have one international diversity now. They need diversity of majors. So there's a lot of people who want to major in STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, right? Not as many in the humanities, but they have these huge humanities departments they have to fill. So they're looking to fill that. They have diversity of athletic teams, right? So, many of these colleges sponsor anywhere from 20 to 24 varsity teams, and they have to fill those out. They have musical acts and debate teams and things like that. So diversity takes the form of many things. And at the end of the day, they are trying to fill all these various seats. And sometimes there might only be one student who could fill that seat. And sometimes there could be 50 students who could fill that seat. And if you're one of 50, tough love, right? Tough luck, right? But if you're that one that they're really looking for, it doesn't matter if they have a 2% acceptance rate, you're getting in.
So then college admissions is really not about you, but more so about what the college needs.
Exactly.
So how does that pertain to transfer students then? We did get a couple of questions about admissions processes for transfer students and whether how heavily they look at kind of your high school extracurriculars when you're transferring from another maybe community college or university.
They're going to really look at your undergraduate thing, and they're really going to look at, especially if you did 2 years at a community college, they're going to be looking at your academics from there. Some schools are really big on transfers. They have a big transfer pipeline. Other schools, again, these more selective schools, maybe only take, a couple dozen, if that, a dozen or two transfer students a year. So if you're looking to transfer, you also have to look at how many transfer students do these schools actually take that I'm looking at. But for the most part, they're going to look at your most recent academic background, not something that's a couple of years old.
Okay. We do have a variety of questions that I think are just more generally about the admissions process. So Lynn is saying, how do you think that AI will impact college admissions selection, if at all?
Great question. I think that on the university side, I think that we might see AI do a first cut of applications. Some places, UCLA got something like 140,000 applications last year, right?
Wow.
That really taxes a human staff.
Mhm.
Could some of those be reviewed more quickly by AI? Could AI be helpful to students on the advising side, right? I talked earlier about school counselors, public school counselors who are overwhelmed, who have a lot of, a big caseload and not enough time. Could AI be helpful there in terms of helping students match up with schools? So I see a lot of positives, but I think we're in the early days right now, and we don't know, exactly what it's going to do. But I do see a lot of opportunity for the most part.
Yeah, and the potential, I'm seeing like the potential negatives of that as well. Say a formula is input wrong, and then you have all of these people denied based on a technicality.
Yes, for every positive, there is a negative, of course, and an AI could also be used to help fill out applications. It could be used to write essays and things like that. So there is some negatives to this as well.
Yeah, it makes me think of Chat GPT maybe writing personal statements, writing the essays for admission. I know that at the college level, there are platforms and systems in place to make sure that students aren't writing using Chat GPT. But I wonder how they'll implement that in college admissions. It'd be interesting. Okay, so Allison is saying, what would you say are problems? What would you say are problems in the college admissions process that are in need of reform? And how can we advocate for high school students to reach their potential through higher education?
Sorry, could you repeat the first part of that?
What would you say are problems in the college admissions process that are in need of reform?
Okay. Well, I think early the explanation I made of early action and early decision, I think especially early decision, is in need of reform. I think that students need the time to consider the schools that they're applying to. I think early decision particularly pushes the process up largely into the junior year when students are need to really think about where they're going to apply early decision. Many students are just not ready. And so as a result, I think that that's one area that I would reform.
Okay. Iris wants to know if you think it's harder for homeschooled students to get into college.
No, I mean, many colleges are used to evaluating homeschool kids. They deal with, as I said earlier, 25 plus thousand schools in the US. They're very used to dealing with schools that don't look like each other, including homeschool students. So, they are accustomed to it. So not more difficult.
Okay, that's good to know. And Amanda would like to know, how much does social media play into your application for college? Could it make or break whether you get in?
No, I mean, it's a great question. They don't have time As I said earlier, they're reviewing these applications in 8 to 10 minutes. They're not Googling you. And in
Okay.
fact, often I saw applications would include like, phrasing or would include acronyms that were not familiar to the admissions officer. Be very clear on this, because what they don't know, they don't know. And they don't have time to Google an acronym to figure out what it means. And they definitely do not have time to look at your social media. Now, you probably have seen headlines of students who got into X university and then their admission offer was pulled because of something that happened on social media. That usually happens after the fact.
Okay.
And it usually happens, I think, because somebody calls up the admissions office, usually a parent, probably of a kid who was denied, and knows of this other kid who was accepted and did something wrong on social media, or a high school counselor might. I don't know how these all often happen, how they find out about them, but they do. And they sometimes will pull these offers if whatever was done on social media is incredibly offensive.
Okay. Yeah, I've definitely seen some of those news stories out
Yeah.
there.
So, but that usually happens after the fact. It usually does not happen because then again, in the moment, they don't have time to be looking at the social media background of all these students.
Mhm. So we did have a question from Tasha about COVID. Tasha says, COVID changed so much. Your book was published in 2020. What is the current situation?
So the current situation is some of what I talked about earlier. I think the big change from the book was that there was this huge surge in test optional admissions.
Mhm.
And as a result, there was a huge surge in applications. And thus, acceptance rates plummeted at a bunch of schools. That is really the big change. And the reaction from the market to that is we need to apply to more schools, right? So you see students now, instead of applying to 10 or 12 schools, might be applying to 12 or 14 or 15 schools. That's really the big change that I've seen over the last couple of years post-COVID.
Okay. I keep thinking, you see on the news sometimes these kids who've applied to like 200 something schools. And is that because of the Common App that they can do that so easily?
They do it so easily, although the Common App does limit you to how many you can apply to. But yeah, it's ridiculous. It doesn't, if you know anything about statistics, it doesn't necessarily mean you have a better shot of getting in the more you apply to, because again, all of these different schools have different admissions criteria.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just think of what it was like when I very first applied to college. I'm like, how do you have time for that? I could barely apply to 5 and have time for it. So Alexandra says, how has your research shaped how you or your kids will approach the college admissions process in the future? I don't
Very
know.
good question. I have kids in middle school, so a little time to figure this out. I guess I've been my eyes have been opened to that there is good fits for everybody somewhere. And that this is not my process, this is their process. Will I help them direct it? Obviously I will, because I'm paying the bill at the end of the day, and there's a decent amount I know about this process. But I did my college search, X number of years ago. This is their search, and I will help guide it. I think that's important. I think it's also important to know that they're going to find a fit at the end of the day, and that, kind of leave them alone and let them figure this out. Do you need to nudge them a little bit? Sure. Do you need to guide them a little bit? Sure. Do you need to put guardrails on the entire process? Sure. But this is not your admissions process. It's theirs. And I think that's probably, of anything that I've learned in this process, that's what I've learned. And now talk to me in a couple of years, and we'll see if I'm as zen about this as I am now. Knowing me, I'm sure I won't be, but I'm hoping that I will achieve some of that balance, and I'm hoping that most parents out there will.
Good. We will check in a couple of years and see where you are. So we have an anonymous question about what your feelings are about legacy admissions. That's been in the news a lot lately.
Yep.
Harvard is being sued right now for so-called legacy admissions, which for people who don't know they're the kind of admissions that maybe your grandfather, your father went to Harvard, for example, and so you get in based upon the legacy of your family. So this person's asking, what do you think about legacy admissions, and do you think they'll go away?
I think it's going to be really hard for institutions. So I don't think they're going to go away. unless forced, because colleges and universities really like them. They really appeal to alumni, they appeal to board members, they appeal to big donors and things like that. So I don't think they're going to go away unless forced. Personally, my mother didn't go to college, and I didn't. My father went to a local college. I don't understand why we should be giving out, spots, or I shouldn't say giving out because we're not giving out spots, but they're definitely helped in the process when they come up against somebody who's not a legacy. I'm not quite sure why that should matter. I get why it should matter from the institutional perspective, but not from the student perspective.
Okay, thank you. Another anonymous question. What about rural area applicants? It seems that community college to university programs work well, but it's not very often that they award scholarships to these kinds of students. Could you please comment on that?
Yeah, there's a big rural urban divide and suburban divide in American higher education. You're more likely to go to college if you're white, if you're wealthier, and you live in an urban area. It's just the way the statistics work. And there's a dearth of institutions in rural areas. And so there's not a lot of choices for students who live there. And it's unfortunate. There's a number of organizations and institutions trying to do something about it. So for example, the University of Virginia just announced that they are going to focus on recruiting students from low sending high schools. Those are schools that never send really any applicants to the University of Virginia, usually in the more rural parts of the state. So people are starting to pay more attention to this, but it's a problem.
Yeah, that's good to know that they are starting to pay more attention. V wants to know, when should we begin college visits?
I don't think there's any exact right time, but again, if you're going to apply early, you want to make sure that you've seen some of these places if you can, junior year or before junior year. One thing that I like to suggest is the type. Remember, I talked about it earlier when I went to University of Washington and Davidson and Emory. They're types of institutions. Almost within a day's drive of anywhere anybody lives, there are types of institutions, whether you want to go there or not. But there's probably a big public flagship university or big public university near your home. There's probably a small liberal arts college. I live in DC. I could go to George Washington and American. I could go a couple hours north and go to Dickinson and see a small liberal arts college. I could see a big research university at the University of Maryland. Even if my kids don't want to go to that, I get them on campus to get a feel. Is this the type of place you want? Do you want big? Do you want small? Do you want urban? Do you want rural? Do you want where sports plays a role? Do you want where graduate students play a role? Those are the important things, I think, that are critical to understanding early on, because it will help then shape the list later on once you understand kind of what you want, or not necessarily what you want, but even where you feel comfortable.
So what about then for students, I guess maybe depending on the length of the answer, this could be our last question, because what do you think about students who are unsure of what kind of major they want? How should they form that in their application process?
You should be honest, right? And actually, colleges sometimes are looking for students who are undecided. Now, where it becomes problematic is if you go to a school where the most popular majors are closed out after essentially freshman year. So, if you don't apply to be a computer science major at the University of Washington as a freshman, you're not going to be able to transfer there sophomore year for the most part internally, right? So it just makes it difficult depending on what major you eventually pick to possibly get into that major at that school. Again, that's really what are called capacity controlled majors. There's not that many of them and not that many schools that do that, but where you have it, it's a problem.
Mm-hmm. And I guess just to close, the number one most important thing about the college admissions process for a high schooler, would you say
control
that's
control what you could control. Okay. You control your grades, you control the classes you take. You can't control who else is applying to school at that college and things like that. There's a lot of things out of your control. Don't worry about those things. You can't control them, right? And so control what you can control. Let the chips fall where they may.
Okay, wonderful advice. Wonderful advice across the hour. Thank you so much for joining us today. Truly, truly had a pleasure speaking with you and listening to all of your sound wisdom. I also want to extend a huge thank you, of course, to our viewers for tuning in to our author talk today. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. And as a reminder, below this live stream video, those 3 tabs there, the one that says resources, you can find a link to Jeff's book. We look forward to seeing you all on September 7th in conversation with celebrity chef, restaurateur, and cookbook author Lydia Bastianich. And again, on September 20th, when we talk to NYU professor and New York Times bestselling author Adam Alter about his latest book, Anatomy of a Breakthrough, How to Get Unstuck When It Matters Most. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon